Now that we finished our extraction steps, we now want to go to transforming and then loading the data into our core layer. So to do that, we now want to head over into Spoon, and we first, of course, want to read the data. And this all we want to define, of course, in a new transformation. That's why we click on File, New, and then Transformation. And the first step, as mentioned, is to read from our staging table. That's why I search for table and double click on table input. Now let's double click again to set up this table. So we can say read data from staging to make it more descriptive. And we can now also select all of the columns. That's why I use a star. And then from our staging table, dim product. And then I can also quickly test it by clicking on preview. And indeed, I see the resulting rows. Also note that the product primary key can be different in your case. This is because I've done some testings before, but this is absolutely fine. That's why we can click on close, and in here also we can click on close. And afterwards, we also want to now start with our transformations. So the first thing that we want to do, if we have a look at the data again, we see we want to clean it. And that's why we first want to search for a step to clean our data. And now I can search, for example, for clean. I don't find anything. I can also try trim, which is a common cleaning process that is just removing all of the white spaces in the beginning and in the end of a string. So this could help us. And when I do that, I find this called string operations. And indeed, this sounds like something that we could use. That's why, again, I double click, and now I double click on the tool to set it up again. And now we can first start with inserting a field. In our case, we want to clean the product name. And now in here, we have this trim type. And again, trimming means we remove all of the leading and ending white spaces because they usually shouldn't be there, and that's why they usually can be removed, as it is in our case. And in my case, I set it to both. So it will remove the white spaces in the beginning and in the end. And now we are still left with something that we also want to clean. If we, for example, double click in here, we see that there's these very ugly tabs. So these are not really white spaces, but these are like tabs. So some special characters that should be also completely removed. And if we go back to Spoon, we see that there is also this option, remove special characters. And if we click in that, we see that we have indeed the horizontal tab that can be removed. And this is what we want to select, and we hope that this is now cleaning our data. We can click on OK, and if we now use preview and then again quick launch, we can see how the data looks, and it looks already really nice. So this is now exactly what we would like to have. So of course, in the end, we still need to test it and have a look at the results in the database as well. But for us, for now, this looks very good. And now that's why we want to go to the next step, which is to extract. We can also click here on preview to extract the values or the characters, the string within these parentheses, because we want to put them into a separate column called brand. And what we could use, for example, we can again search for something like extract. We don't really find anything. So another idea would be to split the column and then just use everything that comes after this parenthesis opening. And then in the end, we can also just get rid of this end because it's always in the end. That's why I search for split. And indeed, I find this tool, split fields. Let's double click on that, because now in here we can split the value from, we can search from the product name and split it into two new fields. The first one would be product name. It's important also to set the type, so it will be a string. And then the new field would be brand. And this again is a string. And I have just said this comma, that was the default value, but we want to, of course, use that opening parenthesis. So I click again on OK and again on preview and quick launch. And now it should look better. Indeed, now we have already at least this string part, and we now just need to get rid of this parenthesis in the end. So this is now also very easy. We can again search for, I would search for replace. So remove is probably not there, and that's why I search for replace. I find it and add it also to our transformations. And again, I double click, and in here I can just again set things up. So I want to use the brand, and I want to search for the closing parenthesis, and I can leave that replace with empty because I don't want to replace it with anything. I just want to basically remove it. That's why, like this, I can immediately click on OK. And again, I want to test it. Click on preview, quick launch, and see that now indeed this looks very nice. So this is how we would like to have it. And of course, in the end, we still also need to output the data. We could use just a simple output, but we can also, in our case, use an update insert. And with that, we could also potentially update values. In our case, this is not really necessary because anyways, we just load data that has never been loaded before based on the product ID. But in general, I also want to demonstrate how this could look like. And that's why in the next lecture, we want to include that update insert and then of course also test our entire workflow. So that's what we are doing in the next lecture. Once we have developed and implemented our ETL process, we of course also want to schedule this job so that it's continuously extracting and transforming and loading the data, so that it's always as up to date as we need to have it in our data warehouse. So usually we can package our workflows, our transformations into jobs or packages. The terminology here is just depending on which type or which ETL tool we are using exactly. But in general, those jobs or packages can then be also scheduled at specific times or specific frequencies. And in this lecture, we want to have a look at how this works and what are the best practices when we want to schedule these jobs. So how should we go about that? In the beginning, I want to say that this scheduling can be either done in the ETL tool itself. This usually requires an enterprise version. So for example, in Pentao, it's in the community version. In the ETL tool itself, not possible to schedule those jobs, but we of course have other possibilities as well. So if this is not possible in the ETL tool, because maybe we are using the free version, then this can be also just scheduled using an external tool. And this external tool just needs to execute basically this job. And this can be done with Windows Scheduler or other things. And oftentimes also we want to deploy those packages or jobs onto a server that is there specifically to execute and perform these ETLs. So this is something that is usually then also done. But now, how can we go about that? We now want to have a look at the guidelines of how we go about scheduling our ETLs. And of course, in the beginning, we need to start with the question, what are actually the requirements of the business users? So this requires us to talk to them and ask them how frequently do they need to have the data updated. And this is then, of course, our starting point. And of course, we are trying to fulfill those requirements as good as it's technically possible. And then if we have those requirements, of course, this is the wish of the customer or the business users, we need to face reality and have a look at how long does our ETL actually take. So some ETLs can perform all of operations in just 1 minute, in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Or sometimes if we have larger amounts of data and everything is a little bit more complex, it can also take up more time. And if the users require 30 minutes updates, but the ETL takes 1 hour, it's very easy to understand that there is some conflict here. So that's why if we have those two things, so how long does the ETL take and how frequently does the customer or the business users want to have the data updated, we can find maybe a compromise or maybe also completely fulfill the requirements. And then once we have figured out that frequency, we also need to talk about what is a good time for our ETL. So when should this be executed? Because we have to keep in mind that we are accessing productive source data. So oftentimes these are productive systems, and the time that we spend with our ETL on these productive source systems for reading the data, this can have an effect on those productive systems. So we might slow them down or even block them entirely if we are using up the resources and maybe blocking them from doing their own operations. So that's why we need to consider this effect on the productive systems, and we can figure out the effect by, for example, just testing some quick data extractions and then determining together with the relevant people that are responsible for those source systems how strong the effect is. And this is something we have to just discuss with the relevant people. And of course, there's a big difference between the initial load, because this takes usually a lot more time and is a lot harder in the load. And then of course also later on it will be much easier with the much smaller delta load, because usually we are just spending, this is why we are doing the ETL in general and building our data warehouse, that we are just very shortly reading the data. So this is usually not a very heavy load, and if it's a delta load, this is usually an effect that is not so bad on these productive systems, so they can usually handle that. But still, we should figure out a good time, and sometimes if we especially talk about the initial load in the night, maybe in the weekends, or maybe at before 6 a.m. in the morning, these can be all good times. But in the end, of course, as mentioned, we should talk to the responsible people, and then we can also just make some testings and discuss it together with them for what would be a good time to execute our ETLs. In this lecture, we now want to also include the update insert, which is not really necessary in our case, but anyways, we want to demonstrate how this could work by just using this update insert. Because with that, we could also be able to update values when there is already a value that has been maybe updated, and this is also something that we want to see. That's why I double click in here. And to set this up, it's also not so complicated. We want to search for our core layer. So the target will be core, target table will be dim product. And now we need to set up also how we should decide whether a row already exists. And if it already exists, we can also specify what fields should be updated. And this should be determined on the key. In our case, we can use the product ID. Maybe in the source system, there will be an update, and then this might be loaded again. Not in our logic, but it could be the case. And that's why we would search for the product ID. And we can just say that this should be, if this is already existing. So that's why we say if product ID is equal to what we already have in our target table, then we should update this value. And then we can also say that we should update all of the fields. We can say that only some of the fields should be updated. In our case, for example, the primary key we don't want to update. So this is now, of course, just an example of how we could deal with something that is now changing. Of course, in our case, this is not so relevant, but anyways, I think it is helpful to see also how it would work if we would set up an insert update operation. That's why we want to click on OK. And now we want to also save this into our load and transform. That's why we click on Save, Load and Transform. And this can be now also included in our job. We can, in our case, just include it also in this staging job. Of course, we could also schedule that in a separate job, but in our case, we just want to use that same job in here. So we want to again insert a transformation, and in this case, it should be now, we can call it transform and load, and it should be, if we click on browse, we enter the path again, and we then want to search for the load transformation. So this should be available in here. And now this is what we would like to have. So now what we still need to do, we remember that, is to update where we get the variable from. So this should now come from our core layer. And we can also just write it like this. And of course, now if we click on OK, and we of course need to again save it. And now if we run this job, we want to, of course, test it and see if things are working now. So now if we head over into PG admin, we can cancel. We should now see in our core table, this dim product, we can also just use a simple command like this. So we use core, and we want to check if the data is now as we expected. And indeed, it is there, which is now really, really nice. So this is exactly what we want. Everything looks perfect. And now we can also just verify if it works, if we get some new data into our source, if this would be also then included in our next run in the ETL, and it would really land in our core layer. That's why I want to also insert. We can just use this insert into command, where we want to now into our source table, want to insert those values in those columns. So therefore, we can just execute that command. And now in the data source, there is now this additional row. And now if we just want to execute our ETL, so then we would expect that now this additional row should be now also included in our core layer. So this is all that we need to do. We just select, and we see that if we scroll down, that indeed there is now this new product also included with our ETL logic. So this is now really great, because we have seen that now things work as we want to have it. So this is really nice, and hopefully this could help you to make things a little bit more practical. I know this were a lot of steps, and it sometimes was probably a bit complicated, but still I hope it was helpful in just demonstrating some practical example. Now we want to start with first setting up the tables and the schema. So we want to go therefore to PG admin, and in here we now want to set up the schema. I have prepared this little notepad document to just copy and paste. So we can just copy that and paste the code in here. Of course, you can also find this code attached to the resources in this lecture. And now the first step is to create this core schema. This is how we want to organize our data warehouse. And that's why we first want to select this row, and then we can execute that command. So now if we refresh the schemas, we can right click and then select refresh. We have now this core. But of course, we don't have any tables included yet. And this is also what we would like to set up. And as we want to also add this additional column brand, we have that included as well. So that's why we want to set up this table structure. We highlight everything, and then with F5 we can execute that. And now again, if we refresh, we will see that now there is also a table included. So this should be done if we refresh the schemas. We can now see that table. But of course, if we want to query from that table, we can see that currently this is empty, and of course this makes sense. That's why we need to set up things in the ETL tool. But now, as we have done that, we want to move on to the next step, which is to set up our output for our staging table. So this is something that we still need to do, and that's why we want to jump into Spoon. In here we have previously already set up these two transformations, so find last load and also then filter with variable. And note that if you have closed them, you can always reopen them up by just going to File, Open, and then you can just open up those KTR files. So this is also what we have saved previously, and you can of course always open them up again. So we have first find the last load where we have read from the table. So this was just getting the last value that we have loaded previously. And then we have stored that in this variable called last load. And then afterwards we have gotten this variable and then read from the source table with this variable included. And now, of course, this output that we have gotten in here, we want to write now back into our staging table. So this is what we still have to do. And that's why we want to search for output, and then we can find output table, and we can drop that in here, connect it again with holding the Shift key, and then we can simply double click. The connection should still be included since we have previously shared this connection. So it's available in all of our transformations. And now we can of course select our target schema, which is the staging, but we need to note that we should also include that into these quotes, because otherwise it will not be case sensitive in Postgres. And then the target table is a dim product. Dim product. What we now have to do is we check this box so that before the rows will be inserted, the table will be truncated. And that's why we check this box. Also, what we want to do is specify database fields. If we check that box, we can navigate to database fields and click on get fields. Now, of course, this maximum row we can select because we don't need it. And then we can just remove it by pressing the remove key on our keyboard. And then we have those 4 rows and we can now click on OK. And of course now we want to also save that so that we can now use both of these transformations and put them together into our job. And then we can set up like this our staging process. So that's why we now want to create a new job. So we go to File, New and Job. And of course, always in the beginning, we need the start. Then afterwards, we can insert our transformations. Again, double click and one more double click. So we have now 2 of them. The first one to get the variable and the second one to retrieve now these additional rows and insert them into the staging table. So now we want to set this up. So we have already the first transformation. Let's double click on that to insert our transformation. And we can do that by just clicking on this browse button. Of course, now we again need to navigate to the folder data integration. That's why I will just copy that path and paste it in here. I hit return, and afterwards we can now find this transformation, find last load date. So we double click and then it will be inserted. And into the entry name, I can just enter a value like set variable, because this is basically what this transformation is doing. I click on OK and this will be now included. And also now the second transformation, filter with variable. So we can in here now say get data, and output data. And the transformation, we can again browse, insert the path, and now search for filter with variable. We use it and then again click on OK. And now, of course, before we want to run that, we need to also truncate the table. So otherwise, we won't get any new values. That's why we want to also execute truncate and then the table. So now if we select again this table, we see it is now empty. And now we can just execute the job. So that's why we want to also click now on this run button. Of course, before we run, we also need to save this. And that's why we save this as staging job. And then this will be executed. So now let's have a look into pgadmin again to see if now there is some additional data available. And indeed, the data has been loaded. So this is now really nice and we have set up our delta logic. But now we still have one problem. Maybe you have already figured that out, but it is very difficult in the logic to find out. That's why we want to see what this problem is that we still have. Because now what happens if we now have no new data rows? That means we have just no values, no rows in the staging. If there are no new values in the source, we won't have any new values in the staging. This is clear. But now this is a little bit problematic because like this, we would always, when in the previous run, are no new values and the staging is empty, initiate the next time a full load because staging is empty and this would initiate a full load. And that's why we would rather get the variable not from the staging but from the core layer. And this is what we have to change then in here, that we don't get this maximum from the staging, but we always want to get it from the core. So it's really the data that we have loaded already, because in the staging sometimes the data can be completely empty. And that's why in the next lecture we want to now set up our transformational steps and then of course also the loading into the core layer. And once we have that, we can also just adjust this in here that we now load it not from staging but from the store layer. And that's why in the next lecture we want to set up our transformation and our load steps. So see you in the next lecture.